So our third presenter is Justin Rami, who is a lecturer in Dublin City University, our own institution that Anna and I work in. He works in the Institute of Education there, in the Faculty of Education, and his teaching and research focus is mainly vocational and teacher education. He is the former Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning in our faculty. He chairs 2 programs and is the Director of the Further Education and Training Research Centre. His current research expertise is in the area of teaching and learning with a specific focus on assessment and feedback and further and vocational education and training. He has published extensively relation to assessment, quality assurance and accreditation, and has worked on European research projects focusing on assessment, recognition of prior learning, qualification frameworks, accreditation, transfer and progression. So I'll hand over to you, Justin.
Okay, can I just check you can hear me okay?
Sorry, Justin, just for one moment. I'm just going to mute everybody because we're just getting quite a bit of background and feedback noise there. So I'm going to mute everybody if that's okay. And then Justin, will you just unmute yourself? Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm not sure what screen view you have. I've got it on my full screen here, so I can just about see some pictures of you there. So I'll be as brief as I can. Let me just set my timer. So again, I just want to thank Claire and Danny for those great presentations and for giving me 2 very hard acts to follow. Well, 3 very hard acts to follow after David as well, of course. I think we're all, in a way, within this group, in a way, preaching to the converted. There's elements of that, but I think what's really good is by looking at other people's practice in this kind of a process is to learn what we can do better in our own institutions. And I've certainly got that from Danny's, David, and Claire's presentations of what I can steal from you and implement in my classroom. I'm particularly interested in the dashboard and the review system you're using, Danny. I think that'll be really helpful for students and for staff as well, to look for those kind of hotspots and the heat map of assessment and how it actually plays out over time. And timing is one of the issues that will come up in this presentation. So as Anne-Marie and Anna said, the paper for this is available on Zenodo, and you can look into more details. So I'll give you a whistle-stop tour of this process that I was involved in, pedagogical dialogue and feed forward. Now I know that word's a little bit contentious, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Working with large classes in the teacher education program in Ireland. Now the teacher education program I work on is related mostly to post-experience teachers who want to work in the non-traditional teaching area, not primary, not post-primary, but more in vocational further education, but also other aspects of non-formal education, adult education, second chance education. So our students tend to be quite diverse in that way. The issue that prompted us looking at this within a module in DCU was coming from Sadler's view about teacher telling. What we noticed was feedback wasn't really feedback. It was really telling, or even as Sadler talks, detailed telling is the most appropriate route to improvement in complex learning. There's an assumption that that is the case, but it isn't really the case. And David referred to that earlier as well. This loop of feedback is really going to be quite important. So learning from being told is flawed as a general strategy because the conditions for these statements to make intimate connection with the student work with a view to future work are rarely satisfied. And we'll look at that teacher-student relationship in a minute. So the idea behind this started about 6 or 8 years ago. And we were looking at those teachers, we were looking at the assessment design, and design is really what this is all about, as Danny talks about, as Claire talked about, and as David talked about. It's all about the design, getting the design right from the start. But it takes years to get that design right, I think, as well. I don't think it's ever perfect. Also, this final concept of dialogue, of that relationship between the student and the learner, but also the intrapersonal relationship the student has with themselves and that idea of internal feedback, I thought was really, really prominent in what David talked about. So that's why I call this pedagogical dialogue. Probably not my phrase. So trying to define that a dialogical feedback, you know, and I think David summed it up well a few years ago by talking about a dialogical process in which learners make sense of information. This idea of making sense is probably the most important about students being able to use the feedback and for the uptake of that feedback to be utilized. And it's about enhancing. And just some pointers here, the dialogical approach to feedback. Within pedagogical dialogue and formative assessment, they share these common principles, and others have mentioned this before by David as well. The emphasis on process, and as Bowd and other people talked about, the need for negotiated meaning and shared understanding of that assessment criteria. Often we find was students didn't really understand what the criteria was, even if you showed it to them in black and white. So you need to explore that part of the meaning of the criteria first of all, and that takes challenge. That's challenging. It also takes a period of time. It can't happen at the end. And then, you know, as Bowd and Malloy and Highland and Paris talked about, this idea of the reciprocal commitment between the assessor and the assessee. That could be the teacher, it could be a student, but it also could be another student to another student. And this idea of peer feedback is really where this model is going towards. Peer assessment, I think, is really important. So the research itself, just checking time, the research itself was based over a period of 3 years, but really it's ongoing, and it looked at a series of different types of data gathering techniques, looking at the performance patterns as Danny has looked at around his students, but also this idea that Claire mentions of the reflective diaries, and these reflective diaries are really, really important, not just from an assessment point of view, but also from an evaluative point of view, be able to see how do we change the model, how do we make things different. Surveys, looking at the literature and those performance patterns, mixing that together over a period of time, and each of them were going through different phases. In the first phase, we looked more about the idea of portfolios, you know, the collection of artifacts, but how do they work? What does portfolio mean? And then we came up with the, you know, the sense that this is really fitting into the socio-constructivist design theory, constructivism being at the heart of it, action being at the heart of it. We were interested in year 2 more about relationships, this dialogical bit, but also about teacher competencies. How well were they able to feed back to each other? How well were they able to develop into that teacher kind of mode? And some of the papers we developed out of this process really just focus on that, on the teacher element. But this presentation really tries to bring it all together a little bit. In year 3 and year 4, we actually looked more about how we transfer the model to other subjects, other areas, because the module I'm talking about was a module about assessment. So in a way, we were trying to practice what we preach, and the idea of dialogue came out of that. So the group itself were a group of full-time students, about 70 plus. Now, I call that large. I know Danny wouldn't call that large. I know some other colleagues on here wouldn't call that large, but for me, that was large. I'm used to quite small, intimate groups, particularly working with adults. We also had an evening group. We call them part-time students, but they're not really part-time, about 25. So roughly 100 students were involved in that process. Looking at the theory a little bit more, the idea of the social constructivist approach, you know, is coming really out of Dewey, and, you know, Biggs and Tang talked about this idea of meaning cannot be imposed, socially constructing meaning, again, Donovan, Rust and Price, and, you know, really back to what Danny talks about there about AFL, Black and William really is at part of this idea that assessment is actually learning, not off learning or as learning, but is learning.
About 2 minutes, Justin.
2 minutes, I'll be quick. So in terms of large classes, how we dealt with that aspect of it was peer assessment, self-assessment and peer assessment. First of all, we did it in large groups, not large groups, but about 20 groups of 5. So they all were working on feedback to individuals and to other groups. So they were doing that collaboratively, which is really, really important. And that worked really well because it strengthened and it helped that idea of social loafing as well, as I was talked about earlier. Connected to learning goals, the timeliness, quality, reciprocation, peer feedback design embedded into the curriculum. So this idea was really quite important. I'll get into the process. We had a task students were asked to design an assessment task based on learning outcomes given to them, hypothetical. So that inspired the idea of being creative, structured thinking, constructive alignment, all those principles that go into assessment design. Also, it was about real life scenario, authentic assessment. Task 2 was that element where the students had to assess or certainly provide feedback. We did do assessment at the start, we did do grading, and that didn't really work out for the issues mentioned earlier. And that's something we've taken away from the process now, and we do a lot of that idea of feeding forward into the next iteration of the task. Doing that helps. I'm going to actually skip that kind of detail maybe and move on to what we find out. The idea of the assessment dialogue, evaluation dialogue, and dialogos as a process of closing the loops, the feedback loops, and the idea of the reciprocation of the student teacher or the student if they're the assessor, listening, feedback or feed forward, or even that idea of flipped feedback seems to fit into that kind of concept. Action, but also coming out of that Freirean view about respect, trust, understanding, mutual respect. All of the things were really, really important in that process, and it also strengthened the relationship between the teacher and the student in the long run, and really formed strong relationships. Sorry, next one. So really, our ongoing findings were about the development of a shared understanding of assessment criteria, and that takes a bit of iteration, a bit of time, where students have to try something, do it again, try something, get feedback, try it again, and they develop that confidence in themselves as assessors, as future assessors. That's my timer, sorry. A shift in emphasis from assessment product to process, which has been talked about before. The idea of mutual relationship, commitment and trust. Heightened self-awareness and both self-efficacy as well as professional competence, as Danny talked about. Student implementations, the utility. This is what we're looking at now more. How do students actually use it? And I'd love to get those analytics of how students have used it in my classes and where did they make use of that. So my final slide goes back to David and Naomi's work from the new book, this old paradigm moving into the new paradigm. Feedback is sense making, focus on student uptake, student generates comments, socio-constructive, and the design is in the middle of that. And I thought that was a really lovely model I saw last year at the Assessment in Higher Education conference when David did a workshop. Lots of references on the paper, and I must also acknowledge my co-author, Francesca Lorenzi, who couldn't be here today, who worked on the original research with me, and that's really it.